Hello, everybody. My name is Fionnuala Dillane, and I'm the president of the Research Society for Victorian Periodicals. And on behalf of RSVP and the European Society for Periodical Research and its president, Mara Lagaldo, who is here as well, along with our colleagues Micah Kaufman in Nijmegen and Peter Boos in Liverpool, you're all very welcome to this second of our ESPRit RSVP seminars. These are seminars that we host together because of our shared interests on issues related to the circulation, the transmission, the mediation of the periodical press that transcend our perhaps period-related concerns or geographical-related concerns. So our first of these seminars was in March, where we looked at the issue of multilingualism in the periodical press. And for anybody who missed that, you can catch up with what we talked about in the field notes section of the latest issue of the Journal for European Periodical Studies. But tonight, or this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where you are, we're delighted to welcome our colleagues from Transfopress, the network for the study of the foreign language press. Key issues, of course, related to both of our interests, our organisational interests, but we want to make sure that we continue to have these conversations so that methodologies and concepts and new directions in periodical research are shared between our communities. So tonight's series of talks, and I'm speaking from the European tonight, will relate to We'll begin with Diane Cooper-Richet, who will talk about the Transfopress network, and that will be followed by 3 presentations. You will then have the opportunity at the end to ask any questions that you're interested in relation to what's been raised across all 4 presentations, or any other comments or issues you'd like to raise that touch on some of the concerns being brought up by our colleagues today. I'm not going to do long biographical introductions, so we can spend the time talking about the bulk of the interesting material that's being discovered here. And instead, I will paste biogs into the chat. At any point, you're welcome to put questions into the chat, which we'll store up for the end. So I will hand over straight away to Diana, who will introduce us to Transfopress and to the concerns of the foreign language press. Diana.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking our colleagues at the Research Society on Victorian Periodicals, and also those at the European Association for Periodical Studies for their invitation. I'm going to try and explain what our activities are, what the object of our research is, our publications, and our projects. First of all, our object. Transfopress is a network of researchers working on the press, more precisely on newspapers and periodicals written in a language which is not that or the or one of the national languages of the country where they are published. For instance, my research concerns the press in English published in France during the 19th century. In 2012, a small group of cultural historians based in France decided to try to attract the attention of their colleagues internationally on the fact that the historians of the press and their more or less official histories of the press in Australia, Canada, Britain, France, and the United States, for instance, and elsewhere also, never mention the existence in their respective countries of the very numerous newspapers and periodicals written and published in foreign languages. It seemed as if these newspapers and periodicals had never existed. The only historians who have studied the press in foreign languages are those dealing with ethnic history and who therefore are interested, for instance, in the history of the press in Italian, published in the US, or in Spanish, published in France by Spanish Republicans. Other historians, notably those specialized in the press, had totally ignored the periodicals published in foreign languages by and for foreigners, be they residents, expats, visitors, entrepreneurs, businessmen, manual workers. This oversight, which is a general one, even in countries such as Brazil, which have developed thanks to the contribution of mass immigration, seem to prove that this press, just because it is printed in a foreign language, has been automatically excluded from the history of the country where it has been published, but also from the history of the country of the people it was published for abroad. For instance, the history of the British press does not pay any attention to the numerous papers in English published in non-English speaking countries, even when they were launched by British editors for their compatriots and were modeled on the British press. Nevertheless, this foreign language press, as we have progressively discovered, has been the vector of many cultural and editorial transfers and exchanges. In Paris, for instance, the first literary reviews in English, inspired by the great quarterlies, put on the market by an Anglo-Italian publisher called Galignani during the first half of the 19th century, served as models for the famous Revue des Deux Mondes, which was launched in 1829. Newspapers, such as the daily Galignani's Messengers, published from 1814 to 1890 in Paris, a daily, every day, over that long period of time, this paper brought many innovations into French journalism. The examples of newspapers in English published in the last decades of the 19th century in countries like Japan and Korea are also very interesting. At that time, end of the 19th century, when the first newspapers in English were published in these two countries, there was no local press. These English language newspapers were at the origin of the national press in both of them. In the next three presentations, my colleague will give you more precise examples of some of our recent findings concerning the foreign language press in different parts of the world. So that is our object. What are the Transfopress activities? Transfopress is based at the Centre d'Histoire Culturelle des Sociétés Contemporaines at the University of Versailles. We run a seminar in Paris, which mainly consists of study days, for instance, on the press in French published abroad, or on the journalists of the foreign language press. We have held Transfopress encounters every year since 2013, 2 in Paris, 1 in São Paulo in Brazil, 1 in Mexico, 1 in Malaga, Spain, 1 in Bucharest in Romania, another in Rome, and another in Valparaiso. These conferences have been organized either in collaboration with a university and or with a national library or an important library. From the beginning, we have wanted to contribute to the uncovering and the saving of the foreign language press wherever it is located. We therefore try as much as possible to work in collaboration with different libraries. And I would like now, with my PowerPoint, to show you some of the results of our research in the form of our publications. So we always try to publish the results of our research. So, Transfopress publications, that was our first one. It was published by some of our colleagues who have been looking into the press in French published in Egypt since the end of the 18th century. Our second one is the result of our conference, our encounter in Malaga. We also have here a number, an issue of a Brazilian review on the French language press in the Americas, North and South. This is one we published, a special issue of a review, a Spanish review, looking at the press in Spanish published in France and the press in Spanish in French published in Spain. This one is on the Balkans. That was one that was organized by Nicolas, who is just beside me, the foreign language press in the Balkans. This is a book we published in Brazil on magazines, 1920s, 1930s, and cross-cultural exchanges. This other one was the result of our conference in Mexico. We have here two, which mainly concern the press in Italian in the States, and here a second one on the press of immigration. This is a special issue we organized for cultural history, which is one of the Edinburgh reviews, and it was mainly devoted to foreign language reading rooms. Here we have another, as you can see, our colleagues in Brazil are very active, and this is also a book they published on the foreign press in general, published in Brazil. This one is forthcoming. It's going to be, as you can see, published by, in London, Immigration and Exile Foreign Language Press in the UK and the United States. This is a forthcoming book Isabelle and I are organizing on the Anglophone press, British press, transnational press in non-Anglophone countries during the 19th century. And the last one is quite original because it's a special issue of a review, a well-known review here in France on questions around the Arab world, and it's on the press in Arab, as you can see, published outside the Arab-speaking world. I now come to, I don't think there's any more. No. I now come to our projects. Among our projects are some of our forthcoming conferences. Next May, at the University of Saarbrück in Germany, we will be furthering our study on the journalists of the foreign language press. In 2024, we will be holding our encounter with Spanish colleagues in Seville. And there, the question I think we're going to treat is very interesting. It's the making, the funding, and the circulation of the foreign language press. And the last one we have on our program will be held at the Pantheon University in Athens on advertising and illustrations in the foreign language press. We also presently have 3 study days on the make, one next April, in collaboration with the Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris on travels and travel literature in the foreign language press. We have another one with the University of Montpellier in the south of France on the foreign language political press. And we hope to be holding one quite soon on theater, the question of theater and theaters and plays in the foreign language press. But of course, last and not least, we are preparing, as you saw on the PowerPoint, with the contributions from about 20 specialists, the Edinburgh history of the transnational British press in non-Anglophone countries, 1800-1914, which we hope will be published in 2020. As you can see from the title of this book to come, I think the idea that the press in English, published in non-English speaking countries, is now considered as part perhaps of the British press. Just a few words to conclude. I think over the last 10 years, we have in some way contributed to the uncovering of this important corpus of neglected documents and brought together colleagues from different fields and different countries who are now conducting research on this press and who are now conscious that these documents need to be saved, protected, and digitalized in some cases when it's possible. Not only are these documents of interest for periodical studies, but they can also help to understand more about how nations and national identities were formed. For instance, during the 19th century, the English language press published abroad, notably in France, contributed to the expansion of the Victorian model. At Transfopress, we started by trying to map the foreign language press worldwide. And there are still areas where the situation is not clear for us, for instance, in Central Europe. It's only very recently that we discovered that a review in English was published in Budapest at the end of the 19th century, but this review still needs to find its historian. Because in fact, finding specialists sufficiently competent in a foreign language and able to document this press has not always been easy. Progressively, we intend to go more and more in depth into the study of the foreign language papers. We need to find out more about the cultural exchanges and transfers they induce. We need to investigate their editors, their journalists, discover how this type of newspaper was produced, where no linguistically fluent printers and proofreaders were available nearby, how they were financed, what was their real circulation, how their content, ideas, text, models moved across borders and oceans and disseminated where were during the long 19th century, were they at the during the long 19th century at the origin of a real transnational print culture? That is one of the questions we would like to answer, and some of the others also. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. Merci beaucoup. You have clearly given us a very a brilliant sense of the phenomenal work that your network has been doing over the past 10 years. It's an incredibly impressive range of publications. And I think in your achievement of mapping, you've already mapped out for us and showing us those publications alone, how much work has been done in recuperation, but also in reorientation of how we begin to understand transnationalism through the work that you're doing. Thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions at the end, but we will move on to our next speakers now. If you'd like to stop sharing your screen, Diana, and we can move on to Jennifer and Michelle. So thank you very much. We're now going to hear from Jennifer Hayward in Wooster College in Ohio and Michelle Prain in Valparaiso, who are going to speak to us about the English language press in Chile and 19th century global networks to the 21st century digital dialogues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fionnuala, for the invitation. And before we jump in, I'm going to start us off. We would just like to thank Diana and Isabelle as well, because we have benefited so much from their leadership and from their wisdom in founding this field. It would have been so much more difficult for us to understand the patterns of development that we saw in the English language press in South America without that larger overarching theoretical framework provided by the Transfopress network. So thank you so much. Hugely valuable work. So we have actually focused our work previously on digitizing this archive, and also we've been really interested in, as Diana gave context for so well, the press as a vector of cultural transfer. So for example, the multilingual nature of the press over time, the increasing hybridity of the English language press within Chile. We're now starting to turn our attention, partly because of our work with the Edinburgh volume that Diana and Isabelle are editing, to the networks of distribution and publication and exchange taking place in South America. So we're particularly interested, for example, in those British editors who were working transnationally, editing British publications, then coming down to Chile and founding English language publications, then perhaps returning. So we'll really be talking about those global networks today. And we're especially fascinated by the early phase of globalization, the many connections between the global South and the global North, which are often ignored today. And part of our work in digitization is attempting to bring those networks back into prominence, and the contemporary research networks that are springing up around digital data. So today we're going to be really quickly giving some context for those publishing networks and for the material circulations of print media throughout South America and then from the global South to the global North. And then we'll very briefly touch on a little bit of the possibilities, at least, of the 21st century digital network in terms of creating these global interconnections and mapping the networks that we're seeing. So just to give another theoretical frame that's been hugely helpful to us, in addition to the Transfopress framework that I mentioned earlier, there's a network called the Hispanic Anglosphere that is working precisely on this 19th century globalization, connecting the global North and the global South. And so we're very interested in this idea of entangled history. I won't read this whole quotation, partly because of time and partly to avoid death by PowerPoint, but we wanted to put this quotation from Graciela Iglesias Rogers out there and really emphasize the idea of the entangled history, the way that we think of these global spheres as so separate, and yet we see the circulation of ideas, the circulation of stories, the circulation of representations within the media, and we've been able to trace them through the big data that's already emerged from, for example, the British newspaper archive, and see those exact same representations in images and ideas circulating through the South American press as well. So a little bit of context. Valparaiso was one of the central ports on the west coast of South America, and before the opening of the Panama Canal, so much trade went through Valparaiso from the 1820s with the opening of trade between countries beyond Spain and the South American new republics, right through the gold rush in San Francisco. Valparaiso was a port through which people traveling to the gold rush passed, and so on. We're fascinated by the polyphonic environment, the polyphony of this space in terms of having Spanish, indigenous languages, variations of English, as well as German, French, Italian, and still more. And we see all of those traces circulating through the British press as well. And so the Anglophone press is generally dominated by English and Scottish editors, but not entirely. And so that's quite interesting as well to trace the nuances of national identity. And so we've been looking at the interconnections revealed over time. The editors of the very early press were primarily business people, and the early press, as we see in the foreign language press, especially throughout the global trade routes, was primarily intended as kind of a shipping gazette to talk about the transfer of goods and services and the prices of those goods and so on and so forth. But this slide is intended just to show how quickly the British grew within Chile over the space of just about 3 decades, and how much of Chilean trade they actually controlled. So 50% of the Chilean exports by 1860 and supplying 33% of the imports. So it was a relatively small population, but very, very influential. And we're just beginning to extract the data from the newspapers we've digitized so that we can start to physically trace these distribution networks on a map. We're also interested long-term in tracing the content and how that shifted over time. So what parts of the world were the English speakers in Chile really interested in reading about? Where did their serial narratives come from? Where did their poetry come from? So we're interested in tracing that content, but also the distribution network. So as we see here, up the west coast of South America, up through Central America, and over to Europe primarily. Mm-hmm. And finally, this is the sort of data that we're beginning to collect and want to make available to researchers worldwide. Just starting, we've got some research assistants who are starting to pull out and tag the physical locations of distribution mentioned in the newspapers. And as you can see in this just very short synopsis. We've got the earliest newspaper, 1843, really doesn't give any information within the newspaper about distribution. By the latest newspaper, we've digitized the Star of Chile in 1904. We see that it's abroad, and we're told which hotels people can find this newspaper in, where people can buy it, where the agents are, and so on. So really rapidly developing distribution network over the course of the 19th century. And turning things over to Michelle, who will talk about a case study.
Yes. Well, as the British population grew in these coasts in Chile, we must have in mind that the Industrial Revolution was growing too. So this is why steam engines, steamers, and population are so much connected in this port. The Pacific Steam Navigation Company was a very important navigation company that worked between Peru, Chile, and the United Kingdom at the beginning, founded by William Wheelwright in 1838. Although he was American, he decided to have the main office in England, and he settled in Guayaquil, Ecuador's main port, in 1833, but quickly moved into Valparaiso, realizing how important Valparaiso was becoming for international trade. So although he founded a line of sailing ships, his real ambition was to start with the service of steamships between Chile, Peru, up the west coast of South America, up to the Isthmus of Panama, to link, of course, the South America west coast to the Atlantic. So that's the beginning of the company. In 1835, the local Chilean government granted Wheelwright the rights to establish these steamship lines between ports and rivers in Chile for the next 10 years. So as you previously saw in the slide that Jennifer was showing, those papers that circulated along the west coast, not of South America, of Chile, but also along Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, to Panama, and even to California, North America. They all, oh, sorry, Jennifer, can we go back, please?
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you. That's okay. So they all traveled in these steamers. So as the title said previously, ink, paper, and steam was quite working together. Well, in 1845, then Wheelwright won the contract for a monthly service between Panama, Callao, and Valparaiso. So not just between Chile and Peru, but also to Panama. And then during the next 20 years, during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there was an explosion really of building steamers in England, in Scotland, and that sailed from Liverpool to Valparaiso via the Strait of Magellan to participate in this Valparaiso-Panama service and in the Chilean cabotage activities. So in this context, we are going to look at a special case, a steamer edition newspaper. That's the Valparaiso Echo. As the subtitle tells us, the organ of the foreign population in Chile, not only the British, but foreign, also considering Americans, of course, North Americans. So this paper was published locally in Valparaiso by the editors of the Diario, that was the local El Mercurio de Valparaiso, the oldest newspaper in Chile, in the Spanish language, and circulated twice a month. For what we can get from the surviving numbers we have at the National Library in Chile, in 1853, this Valparaiso Echo traveled in steamer Bogota, in steamer Bolivia, and in steamer Lima. All of them were passengers steamers. They were built in England or in Scotland, in Glasgow. And well, it was very interesting that we see that these same steamers, if we go to the next one, Jennifer, please, or the next one. Yeah, no, sorry, it was the previous one then.
This one,
Sorry.
yes?
No, the other one. The previous one. Yeah, they traveled not only through the west coast to Panama, but also through the Magellan Strait to Liverpool, also stopping in Montevideo, Uruguay, and Rio de Janeiro. So also the east coast of South America was incorporated within this network of steamers and the circulation of these newspapers. The next one, please. Yeah, that's only a sample of the ads of the company that reached also eventually ports in France. And the next one, please, Jenny. Okay, so now Jennifer is gonna go into the digitizing process and going from the material to the digital archive with these papers produced in Valparaiso that are kept at the National Library, the only surviving ones that we have been able to find in among other libraries too.
Thank you, Michelle. Fionnuala, I think we only have a couple of minutes left. Is that correct?
Yeah, about 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay, great. So I'll zip through quite quickly. So we mentioned earlier this transformation from the material to the digital archive. And so these are some of the newspapers we've digitized. We include these slides to show that we have actually had to have them professionally restored before digitizing, because as Diana mentioned earlier, these newspapers are really invisible to everybody. The British Library is not interested because they're not published in Britain. Chile is interested, but their digitization priority is starting with the cultural patrimony in the native language of the country, which makes perfect sense. So these newspapers were nowhere in their digitization plans, but they were thrilled. They've been thrilled to partner with us to digitize them. These are just a couple of examples of what the first page of some of these papers look like. And so this is what we've been focusing on. We've created a digital archive, and we're really thrilled to be able to provide both the PDFs and the metadata to illuminate these lost connections between Latin America and Britain in the 19th century, and raises fascinating questions of memory, of the preservation of the material object, and of possibilities for transnational research as well, of course. And so this is the first phase of our digitization. The images are now available through us and through our project, anglophonechile.org, and through the National Digital Library of Chile as well. And so just to conclude, Michelle, do you want to take this conclusion or shall I?
You go ahead, please.
Okay. So thanks again to the Transfopress network for this study of the transnational print culture that has been so important to how we have both conceptualized the project and acquired the theoretical tools. The RSVP organization has also helped us to acquire the training, the practical technical skills necessary to digitize. So that's so interesting. And finally, we're really recently turning our attention to this concept of networked liminality rather than networked connectivity, looking at how individual nodes in a network are not all mapped equally. There's unequal and shifting relationships depending on questions of power, questions of production and consumption, and so on. So that's where we're going next with this project. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So Nicolas Pitsos is going to speak to us now in the foreign language press. and the emergence of a polyphonic capital, the case of Paris. So Nicola, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Fionnuala. Thank you very much for having invited me to join this panel. I'm very glad to participate and talk to you about this issue, this topic. So today I would like to share with you some experiences and reflections from my participation to the fabric of an exhibition and the organization of a conference within and by the Transfopress network. In both cases, it was about foreign language press published in Paris in the 19th and 20th century. Foreign language press considered as a source for studying socio-urban history, migration history, but also, and above all, foreign language press as a subject on its own for writing a polyphonic history of French press, and more particularly, press published in Paris. So here are the posters of these two events. You may ask me, why studying foreign language press in Paris? For many reasons. First of all, because it represents a large number of publications. Just in order to provide you with some idea of the scale, of the magnitude of this phenomenon, between 1944 and 1989, there were 1,000 periodicals, according to Antoine Marès, published in France. Then, because these titles, these periodicals, have very often not yet been taken in consideration within the field of press history, of national press history. They are the forgotten ones, the neglected ones, as Diana told us just before. And finally, because the study helps us to shed light on and to better understand urban history, migration patterns, sociocultural aspects of Paris life, and the linguistic diversity, plurality, variety of Parisian press and of Parisian society as a whole in a perspective of entangled history, as Jennifer told us before. So Paris, like most European and international metropolis, was built over time through a series of migration waves, both from within France and from abroad, as Antoine Marès showed us in his works such as Le Paris des étrangers. People came to Paris to run away from repression or political persecution, take advantage of the scientific and artistic stimuli offered by the city, or simply to earn a living. Within this cultural mosaic and this patchwork of languages, a series of newspapers and periodicals have been published to address the needs and interests of people whose mastery of the French language was sometimes limited or inexistent. So the two events we organized this year as Transfopress Network highlighted the presence of foreign language press published in Paris and its outskirts, as well as its contribution to a better understanding of the topography, the polyphony, and the sociology of the city. Here you can see the languages, some of the languages which were represented in the periodicals studied during the Congress and or posted during the exhibition. Among these periodicals, we had the periodicals published in Italian or in Spanish against the dictatorships established in these countries, the authoritarian regimes established in these countries. We had also periodicals of the dissident representing the dissident press in the official languages of Eastern Europe during the Cold War, as Kontakt in Polish or Ruska Mysl in Russian. We had also periodicals in Greek or in Armenian, addressing mainly a public of refugees of the First World War. Here we can see the case of Haraj, a periodical published in Armenian since 1925 onwards until to 2009. It's probably the longest living newspaper at this category. But we had also cases of talking us about the pioneers of this story, of this history, such as the Lebanon, which initiated the history of press in Hebrew in Paris, or the Ethniki Epitheoresis, the National Review, which was one of the first periodicals published, illustrated periodicals published in Greek in Paris, and Birgis Baris launched in Arabic, the first periodical in Arabic launched by Soliman Al-Hariri in 1859. We also paid attention during these events and how this press influenced the evolution of the Parisian sociocultural landscape and facilitated a better integration of its readers to the host country, even through manifestations of protest, such as the ones denouncing racist discrimination, as you can see in this periodical Al-Badil, published in Arabic, and which related manifestations against racism in the city of Paris during the 1980s. Our aim was also to discover the sites connected to the production and circulation of these periodicals, identifying the actors, the persons who initiated them. And these periodicals stimulated as well specific cultural and economic life, thanks notably to advertisements for businesses or associations, which reflected the activities of various linguistic communities, as you can see here in this Greek, in this periodical published in Greek, Agon, during the interwar period. Was it the first time such an initiative had been undertaken and developed? No, not exactly. In 1989, at the occasion of the bicentenary of the French Revolution, an exhibition took place titled in Paris, titled France des étrangers, France des libertés. It was organized by the Association Générique, and at the aftermath, it was an exhibition which took place at the aftermath of various initiatives willing to denounce racist discourses and practices within French society of that time. An album came out of this event under the title Presse et Mémoire, Press and Memory. This book offered a panorama of foreign language press in France. 30 years later, the two events we organized allowed us to introduce into this research field new languages, new approaches, new sources. So, new languages, in the sense of periodicals published in languages which had not yet led to systematic research. For instance, periodicals in Hungarian, as you can see here in this slide, or in Ukrainian, in Chinese. And here, I don't know if you recognize the political figure which appears in this periodical published in Chinese. It's the French mayor, the mayor of Paris City at the 1980s, Jacques Chirac. And it's very interesting to study interactions between local authorities and the readership of these periodicals, as in that case, Jacques Chirac addressed his wishes for a happy Chinese New Year to the readers of this periodical of the Long Bow. Periodicals also in Japanese, Vietnamese, Persian, Tamil, or in Georgian, sometimes with bilingual editions. New approaches, such as the cartography, for instance, of fascist and anti-fascist strongholds in 1920s Paris through the study of advertisements in the Italian-speaking newspapers. The role also of the periodicals as vectors of memories, in the case of Naye Presse, which was one of the iconic titles of the Yiddish Parisian press. And then new approaches, such as the ones introducing us to reading practices, such as reading rooms for an English-speaking public during the early 19th century, described by Diana for Galignani's Messenger. New sources, the place of illustrated press, for instance, with the case of the late 19th century Lusophone press studied by Bruna Oliveira Santiago, or the satirical press, such as Gavroche in Armenian, or the work of Katerina Lobodenko on the Russian-speaking periodicals published by Russian refugees during the interwar period. These periodicals were produced in print shops and circulated through distribution networks. The occasion of the exhibition, which took place at the Academic Library of Languages and Civilizations, BULAC, we wanted to associate the circulation of this press to the history of editorial, print, or publishing houses which hosted or produced the newspapers and these periodicals. We can mention just some of them, such as Bindi Yande, which means studies and literature. Bindi Yande was an association established by students coming from Africa in the 1980s, who were willing to promote the use and practice of languages during the pre-colonial era in Africa. They published the periodical of the same name, as well as folk tales and collections of poems in Wolof, Swahili, Pearl, and other languages. There was also the case of Khmer, meaning native land, homeland, a publishing house founded by refugees from Vietnam in the 1970s. Situated at Gennevilliers, an outskirts of Paris, they published both a monthly periodical, as you can see in this slide, as well as novels and essays by dissidents living in France. Another publishing house was this of the association called Arabie sur Seine. This house was created by the fascinating personality of Abdul Qader el-Janabi. Born in Baghdad in 1944, he was forced into exile in London after the Ba'ath Party came to power in Iraq. In London, he joined the international Marxist group headed by the British historian and intellectual of New Left, Tariq Ali. Settled in Paris since 1972, he founded a periodical, we can see in this slide, in a bilingual edition, Le Désir Libertaire, Al-Ragba el-Ibahiyya, a tribune for surrealism in Arabic and French. And of course, there was the Institut Literacki, a major center for the edition in Polish during the Cold War at Maison Lafitte. Besides the emblematic periodical Kultura, they also published works of Józef Warszawski, one of the leading figures of Polish intelligentsia in exile. For their part, the publishing house Zwiejewski marked the editorial landscape in Czech and Slovak. Whereas coming back to the beginning of the 20th century, Vozrozhdenie, there was a publishing house which reflected the edition in Russian in Paris of that period, with a newspaper and a series of novels and essays. What it's very interesting to comment about this image, this slide, is here we have an advertisement for the activities of Vozrozhdenie, of this publishing house, in another Russian-speaking, another periodical published in Russian in Paris during the 1960s, Russka Mysl, Russian Thought. And I think it's very interesting to study the interperiodical dialogue which developed in that way. We can also mention during the interwar period the publishing house called Yash Turkestan, Young Turkestan. At its head, we can find Mustafa Tokay, coming from a noble Muslim family in Kazakhstan, who fought for the recognition of civil rights of Central Asia people within the Soviet Union, and who also launched the periodical Yash Turkestan. During the same period, Lukas Kastanakis, originating from the Greek-speaking community of Constantinople, created the publishing house of the same name, Agon, which means effort, where a periodical and several novels in Greek language were portraying 1920s Paris life. And last but not least, we could also mention the publishing house of Trizub, founded by Simon Petliura, journalist and leading figure of the movement for the Ukrainian emancipation. Next to these publishing houses, we wanted also to tell the story of printing houses, which played a major role in promoting foreign language press. Just to mention two of them, Beresniak House, which represented a real hubbub, a real editorial crossroad in the Parisian editorial landscape since the 1920s till the early 1970s, with a series of periodicals published in several languages, such as Yiddish, Russian, Polish, Bulgarian, and so on. And then Arax, one of the many printing houses in Armenian, emerging in Paris after the arrival of Armenian-speaking refugees from nowadays Turkey or Soviet Union during the 1920s. Arax was founded by the brothers Topalyan, and one of them, Uzan Topalyan, was also a painter. And in 1952, he created a bilingual periodical for arts and literature, which we can see the title of this periodical in this slide, Understand, which means cultural heritage. Finally, and I would like to conclude with this reflection, we hesitated for a long time between at least two ways for how narrating this history, these stories, how to organize, how to present the results of these researches. On the one hand, there was an approach leading us to construct our narrative in linguistic or geolinguistic terms. For instance, talking about the history of periodicals published in English in Paris or in the official languages of Central Europe, Middle East, or Latin America throughout the 19th century, 20th century. And then, on the other hand, there was an approach in chronological terms, trying to delimit, outline, critical historical periods, and proposing a synchronic study of this editorial phenomenon. For instance, the foreign language press published in Paris during the interwar period of the Cold War. And it was this narrative thread we have adopted for the time being in order to present the results of this real exciting experience, the stimulating work and passionate exploration, which goes on. And let's hope to see a book coming soon to a library near you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I definitely am looking forward to the book coming to a library near me soon. I think you've done a very compelling presentation on the polyphony of Paris and its very complex, entangled histories, which you brought to great life there through the magazines. I think giving a real sense as well of both the political refuge and cultural memory and the relationship between both of those things from the makers and producers of the press in Paris during that historical span that you've just talked us through. And those methodological challenges, how to tell the story, I think is something that anybody who works in the press will be familiar with. But the emphasis, I think, here on collaboration as a necessity in mapping this Paris is very, very clear. So if you would like to stop sharing your screen, I'm sure you'll get questions later on and we will come along to Isabelle. So Isabelle will now speak to us about Helen Zimmern and the Italian Gazette. The editor is a cultural go-between. So thank you, Isabelle. I'll hand over to you.
Yeah. So after these three presentations, and there were sort of panoramas of the press in this part of the world, I'm going to focus on one journalist and one English weekly published in Italy. So Helen Zimmern, famous Victorian journalist and writer, totally forgotten today, but who was quite famous at the time. And I intend to continue working on this person. So among periodical editors' many roles, that of a transnational or cross-cultural mediator is particularly relevant for our corpus of foreign language press. And this is what I want to try to illustrate by looking at the career of Helen Zimmern, as this is the only portrait of Helen Zimmern that exists. As editor of an English language periodical in Florence, the Italian Gazette, that she transformed from, as she claimed, from a rubbishy paper, it was called the Florence Gazette first, into the best English weekly published on the continent, the Italian Gazette. She was very much into self-promotion. So to do this, I will show how her personal and professional trajectories made her a cultural translator as she actively moved from the British to the Italian context. Of particular importance were her many connections with the journalistic and intellectual worlds in Britain, Europe, and Italy, and I will show how she mobilized these contacts to enhance the cultural appeal of a weekly and to heighten the interest of British people in all the developments of modern Italian life, which was her stated goal as editor for English Florentine Weekly. A few words about her. In more ways than one, Zimmern was a representative figure of the literary fin de siècle cosmopolitanism recently studied by Stefano Evangelista. Her personal background had prepared her for an intellectual career that would from the start transcend national boundaries. She was born in Hamburg in 1846 in a liberal German Jewish family who emigrated to Great Britain after the failure of the 1848 revolutions. She was educated mostly at home with an emphasis on philosophy and foreign languages, and decided very early on a career as a translator and a writer. She published her first text at the age of 20 in Once a Week, then she published short stories for young people in other magazines. In the 1870s, she started mixing with a group of young women with literary aspirations who were drawn to the Athenaeum by the new owner, Charles Dilke, who wanted his periodical to be a window to the world that would present his readers with a kaleidoscope of foreign cultures. And to that effect, he recruited a number of women writers who had a solid mastery of foreign languages and a good knowledge of the European cultural production. And Zimmern was one of them. She regularly published reviews of German and Italian works in the Athenaeum, but also in Blackwood's, Cornhill, Fraser's, and other magazines. At the same time, she published in 1876 a biography of Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher, and in 1878 a biography of Gotthold Lessing, the writer and poet. Two books that established a reputation as an erudite yet accessible writer. She also translated in the 1880s the prose work of Lessing, the comedies of Carlo Goldoni, and many other books. So she belonged to what Marisa de Moor has described as a new generation of professional women journalists and writers. And thanks to her multifaceted and wide-ranging writing activity, she navigated between different transnational networks. Indeed, most of the young women writers and journalists she associated with, Mary Robinson, Kate Field, Julia Cartwright, Violet Paget, alias Vernon Lee, were all drawn to Italy. This was particularly true for Vernon Lee, who settled in Florence in the early 1880s, where a salon attracted the European and Italian cosmopolitan intelligentsia. It was also the case for some of Zimmern's writer and artist friends, such as Samuel Butler, Edmond Goss, Alma Tadema, or Hubert von Herkommer, with whom she often visited Italy before settling there in 1887. Thanks to a biography of Schopenhauer, she also had important connections with Germany. Having read the book, Richard Wagner himself invited her to Bayreuth and introduced her to Nisch, with whom she established a long-lasting relationship and translated later some of his major works into English. Knowing how important those networks were for her journalistic career, she feared that by moving to Italy for health reasons, she would lose these work connections. But this was not the case, thanks in particular because of a frequentation of Vernon Lee's salon, where she could keep in touch with the European cosmopolitan intellectuals and also become acquainted with many contemporary Italian artists and writers, and thanks to the salon of another British expatriate, Linda White, where also many intellectuals met. And through her own efforts, she developed new connections in Italy, always on the lookout for work opportunities because she worked to earn her living. She had started sending articles on Great Britain to the Italian the Corriere della Sera. And this developed into a collaboration that lasted from 1884 to 1910. A twice monthly article under the heading Corriere di Londra was signed and paid at the same rate as male journalists, which was not always the case at the time. And this was a point she insisted on, and that would make it difficult for her to collaborate with Italian literary magazines, although she was well known in Italy thanks to the translation of the life of Schopenhauer. Various contacts with some of the major Italian magazines did not lead to any publication, with one or two exceptions, because as she wrote to De Gubernatis, who was really the major literary figure in Italy at the time as a publisher of review, unfortunately, I cannot afford to write for glory and therefore cannot accept the financial conditions you offered. And that's why she accepted the job of editor that the owner of the Florence Gazette offered her in 1892. She really had to secure a regular income. As was sometimes or even often the case for foreign language periodicals, the owner of the paper was a businessman with no experience in journalism, who felt that a weekly targeting the large British community, estimated by the British Council at 30,000 residents, or 12% of the population of Florence at the time. So this would attract numerous ads from local businesses catering to these expatriates, which was indeed the case. And the weekly, which started in 1890, was entirely paid for by the ads that occupied 3 of its 8 pages and sometimes the front page. Another page published the list of British residents, and another page information useful for the tourists visiting the city, which left 3 pages dedicated essentially to society gossip, and once in a while a short story or travel notes from some resident celebrity. There were only a few noticeable changes in the first 2 years of Zimmern's editorship. The society gossip tended to give way to social and cultural information. And there were a few more in-depth articles, such as reports about the situation of women in Italy or in the world, a study of architecture, of the villas of the Medicis, a regular section about literature. But in 1894, the original owner went out of business, and Zimmern was able to buy the paper together with the printer who produced it. She was then in charge and totally transformed the weekly, starting from its title, which she changed to the Italian Gazette, so as to expand her readership. While she kept the business model, the ads should pay for the paper and the tourists should buy it, and therefore they should find the information they needed for their stay in the paper. She increased the number of pages to 16 and more if necessary. It often had actually 20 or 24 pages, and gave the weekly a strong cultural tone. Although she stated in an interview to the Publishers Circular in 1895 that her aim had been from the start to interest British people in all the development of modern Italian life, she clearly eschewed political or economic issues and dedicated the pages of her weekly to Florentine past and present culture. She was probably aware that for most British people, the visit to Italy was an intellectual journey to a place of culture, and that her potential readers would be more interested in Italy's art than in her agriculture or industry. Also, her own intellectual leanings and those of the people she would invite to write in the weekly weighed heavily toward art and literature. As editor, she clearly made the decision to act as cultural go-between between her British readers and past and present Italy, by publishing in-depth articles that went far beyond sketchy description of guidebooks and giving them the opportunity to participate in the country's cultural activities. Indeed, in the paper, she strove to maintain a clear balance between the history of medieval and Renaissance arts and architecture and the coverage of contemporary artistic production in Florence and the peninsula, but it was really concentrated in Florence. To that effect, she recruited Roberto Nobili, an Anglophile Italian art historian who wrote mainly about Renaissance architecture, but was also well introduced in the Florentine artistic milieu and regularly informed readers about the goings-on in those circles. She also hired Annie Evans, a British journalist and self-trained art historian who wrote sometimes about the old masters, but more importantly, toured the studios and art exhibitions and reported almost weekly about the work of contemporary artists. An anonymous author, I haven't been able to identify her, or him, probably her, there were many women writing in this paper, wrote a weekly section about music in Florence, a city that counted 2 opera houses, several concert halls, and some of the best music schools in the country. Another regular section covered the archaeological excavations that were in full swing at the time. It was written by Eduardo Strutt, the son of the well-known archaeologist Arthur Strutt, who from 1846 to 1849 had edited an English weekly, The Roman Advertisers in Rome. You see, this was a small world. Some of her writer friends often contributed occasional pieces. Samuel Butler, for instance, gave the Italian Gazette the scoop of his thesis about the Sicilian authors of the Odyssey. He claimed it had been written by a Sicilian woman. William Spence, Charles Leyland wrote pieces about the history of Florence, and she also convinced Onorato Fava, a well-known literary figure from Naples, to publish some of his short stories in the Gazette. So indeed, she claimed that it was the best English weekly published on the continent. I don't know, but it was a very interesting, when you read it, it makes for very interesting reading. As Zimmern's own journalistic writings at the time reflected her self-assigned role of cultural broker. So I've been able to identify some of her signed articles. There are many pieces in the weekly that she wrote but are not signed, so it's not always easy to identify them. So here I compared the articles I was able to identify signed by her in the that she published, well, signed by her in the Italian Gazette, with what she was writing at the same time in British journals and Italian Review, to see the cultural circulation. So for instance, in the Italian Gazette, she wrote in 2 installments about a guy called Salvini, I've forgotten his first name, who was a major Shakespearean author. And in this, these 2 articles, first of all, she tries to convince British readers that a non-British could be a major Shakespearean actor, and she also praised his very modern style of acting that actually inspired Stanislavski later on. She also wrote this article on Robert Dudley, a Renaissance figure. Is the occasion of comparing the Renaissance heroes in England and Italy. Art exhibitions, so another occasion to focus on the contemporary production of artists in Italy, and articles on Renaissance Florence. What's interesting is to compare this with what she wrote in British journals at the time, and also, and unfortunately you can't see it properly, all the, can I get rid of this? Oop, no, I'll do it in a moment. So when you look at what she wrote in British journals at the time, apart from 1 or 2 pieces on Bologna, it's a history about, and a new Botticelli, most are about contemporary writers and artists, Italian poets of today, Italian culture. She wrote the first article outside of Italy on Telemaco Signorini, a major figure of the Machiavelli movement, the Italian impressionist, and she actually introduced him to the British public, with whom he was very popular. A modern Roman artist, Aristide Sartorio, Giovanni Gantini, all focused criminal anthropology, because she was very close to a very famous criminologist, Lombroso, in Italy, and she writes about it. If you look at what she managed to publish in Italian reviews, which was later on, and I'm interested in the bottom line, she published a series of articles in a review called Emporium, which was a modern art review copied of some of the British magazine. And here again, all the articles she published are in contemporary British artists, Tadema, Paul Magnus Brown, Ercomer, Ruskin, well, Ruskin was a bit older, Edward Poynter. So I think this comparison, where I would finish my paper, is a good illustration of a participation in transnational cultural exchanges and a role as a cultural go-between. I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Isabelle, and thank you all speakers for such a beautifully curated set of presentations, taking us in a wide variety of approaches to the foreign language press